With Away, Hey, Mr. Stormalong, retold by Amy L. Cohn and Susie Schmidt. No one knows exactly where he came from, but most agree it was one of those New England towns hard by the sea, one of those towns ending in Nuck or Knocket or Tucket. Old Stormalong, they called him, or Stormy for short, but his real name was Alfred Bulltop Stormalong, and though he wasn't very old, he sure was tall, 4 fathoms tall. When he signed on to the Lady of the Sea, the captain nearly lost his eyesight looking up at him. But he let Stormy sign on all the same. Stormalong A.B. wrote the new hand. The captain looked at the ledger and said, "You're able-bodied, all right." Well, all the first-class seamen standing in line behind Stormalong put A.B. after their names too, and right there on the Boston waterfront a new tradition started. Now the Lady of the Sea was one of the largest ships ever built, but Stormalong still had to be careful not to step too heavily or pull too hard. Fact was, he could rig sails to the highest mast without leaving the deck, so the captain couldn't help but promote him to the boatswain right away. For you landlubbers, that's boatswain, meaning Stormy took charge of the rigging and the cables and such like. But, like I said, those 4 fathoms could sure cause trouble, especially around mealtime. Only ostrich eggs could fill Stormy at breakfast, and he drank whale soup from a dory for lunch. Feeding Stormy was a full-time job in itself, and many a worn-out cook handed in his apron in disgust. But Mr. Stormalong was too valuable a hand to dismiss on account of his prodigious appetite. One time when the Lady of the Sea was in the northern Atlantic, a lookout spotted a good-sized whale to starboard. All free hands went to crank in the mudhook, but even with Stormy heave-hoing, it wouldn't budge. Stormalong didn't bother to call the captain. He stripped to the waist and dove overboard. The men waited and waited and waited. Turns out that at the bottom of the anchor chain, Stormalong met an enormous octopus who had wrapped his tentacles around the anchor and wouldn't let go. Stormy grabbed the octopus and swiftly tied each arm into a double carrack bend. He made the knots so tight that the beast turned scarlet and scurried off on tiptoe. At last old Stormy came back upside and gulped a breath of air. The sailors whistled and stomped, and the captain gave the boatswain the rest of the day off. Eventually even Stormy got tired of salt pork and hardtack and cramped quarters on the ship. When the Lady of the Sea pulled into the long wharf, he quit, hoofing it inland to try his hand at potato farming. Wasn't but a year or two later he appeared at the wharf, peaked and dispirited, his eyes gazing hungrily out to sea. Sure, he'd been a successful farmer, but as he himself said, "All my muscles were made for pulling, and on a farm there's nothing to do but push." His timing was perfect, for the largest ship ever built was taking on crew. She was so big she couldn't enter Boston Harbor. Her mast was so tall it pierced the clouds, and she took so long from stem to stern that it took a man on horseback 24 hours to make the trip. Stormy swam 10 miles to get to the courser, signed on, and was soon happier than a porpoise. Before the ship headed for the high seas, the captain did the only right thing and bowed out, letting the big man take his place. The courser could ride out a storm like a bobber on a pond. Course, there was no telling where it might end up, and once, on the way back from Norway with a hold full of pickled herring, she was swept into the English Channel. Directly ahead loomed the narrow straits of Dover. The courser had no room to come about. She'd have to go through. Stormalong directed the crew to gather up all the soap on board. What they found didn't amount to a barrelful, but Stormy wasn't stumped. He dispatched a party ashore, telling the men to trade the herring for as much of that slick stuff as they could get. Before too long, Captain Stormy sent his able-bodied seamen over the deck rails in boatswain's chairs to swab the courser's sides with soap. The men spread the greasy soap so good and thick that even the barnacles lost their grip and slid off. Working in 2 ships, the sailors finished in just 3 days, and they were all cleaner than a whistle when they got through. Sober sailor faces watched as Stormy squeezed the mighty clipper through the gap. The ship scraped and rubbed and strained against the north shore, but thanks to the soap, she made it. Most of it rubbed off, though, and that's why they call them the White Cliffs of Dover. Now, you would think a man as mighty as Stormalong would live forever. But he died, that's sure. Not a soul knows how, but everyone knows when. They laid Stormy's body to rest about the time those newfangled steamships challenged the graceful old clippers for control of the seas. Stormalong and his mates were iron men who went to sea in wooden ships, and it broke the big man's heart to see the iron ships crewed by wooden men. I'd rather be found dead than aboard a steamboat, he vowed, and sure enough, the salt spray splashed atop his grave before the last Yankee clipper furled her silver sails.